They stand like statues. Silent. Unmoving. Eyes fixed ahead while thousands of tourists snap photos inches from their faces. The bright red tunics, the towering bearskin hats, the polished boots that never seem to shift even a millimeter. To the world, they are nothing more than living decorations outside Buckingham Palace. But, what happens when no one is watching? What happens when a lost child tugs at their perfectly pressed uniform, or when an elderly veteran struggles to stand during a ceremony, or when tragedy strikes and protocol means nothing compared to human compassion? Behind those stoic expressions and rigid postures beat the hearts of ordinary men and women who have sworn extraordinary oaths. They are fathers who miss bedtime stories, mothers who worry about their own children while protecting others, and young soldiers who join to serve something greater than themselves. This is not the story you see in the newspapers. This is not about changing of the guard ceremonies or royal weddings. This is about the moments when duty and humanity collide, when following orders take second place to following conscience, and when the most disciplined people in the world choose to break their own rules. These are the stories they never meant for you to hear. The moments captured not by official photographers, but by chance witnesses who happened to be there when a royal guard remembered they were human first, soldier second. In a world that often feels cold and divided, these small acts of unexpected kindness remind us that compassion can bloom anywhere, even behind a ceremonial mask, even while standing perfectly still, even when the whole world is watching. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Guardsman James Mitchell adjusted his bearskin hat one final time. The weight of it still surprised him after 6 months of duty, pressing down on his skull like a constant reminder of the responsibility he carried. At 22, he was one of the youngest members of the Coldstream Guards, and today marked his first solo posting at the palace gates. The early tourists were already gathering, cameras ready, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous guards who never moved, never spoke, never acknowledged the world around them. James had practiced this stillness for months. Stand straight. Eyes forward. Breathing steady. No matter what happened, no matter what anyone said or did, remain perfectly motionless. His commanding officer, Sergeant Williams, had been clear about the rules during their final briefing the night before. You are representing the crown, Mitchell. Every second you stand there, you embody centuries of tradition. Tourists will try to make you laugh, children will tug at your uniform, people will say things to get a reaction. You give them nothing. Nothing at all. The sergeant had paused, his weathered face serious. But, remember, son, if there's genuine danger or someone needs real help, use your judgment. We're soldiers first, statues second. As the clock tower chimed 8 o'clock, James took his position. The familiar weight of his rifle, the precise angle of his stance, the measured breathing that would carry him through the next 2 hours. This was what he had trained for. This was his moment to prove himself worthy of the red tunic and the trust placed in him. The first hour passed without incident. Tourists came and went, snapping photos and chattering in languages James couldn't identify. A few attempted the usual tricks trying to get him to smile or move. One man told jokes. A group of teenagers made funny faces. A woman spent 10 minutes describing her breakfast in elaborate detail. James remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the palace walls. It was during the second hour when everything changed. James noticed her from the corner of his vision, a small girl, perhaps 5 years old, with tangled blonde hair and a dirty pink dress. She stood apart from the other tourists, alone near the palace railings. She wasn't taking photos or trying to get his attention like the others. She was simply standing there, tears streaming down her small face. James fought the urge to look directly at her, maintaining his forward gaze while using his peripheral vision to assess the situation. The child was clearly distressed, but where were her parents? He scanned the crowd as much as he could without moving his head. Groups of tourists clustered around other guards, families posed for photos, couples consulted maps and guidebooks. No one seemed to be looking for a missing child. Minutes passed. The little girl remained alone, her quiet crying becoming more pronounced. James felt his training warring with his conscience. Protocol demanded he maintain position and ignore distractions. But everything in his heart screamed that a lost child was not a distraction, it was an emergency. The girl took a tentative step closer to him, then another. She was now directly in front of him, looking up at his face with wide, tear-filled blue eyes. She said something he couldn't quite hear over the noise of the crowd, then, louder, "Mr. Soldier, I can't find my mummy." The words hit James like a physical blow. He had a younger sister about this age back home in Yorkshire. The thought of her lost and frightened in a crowd of strangers made his stomach clench. Still, he maintained his position, his training holding him rigid even as his heart broke for the scared child before him. The girl reached up and tugged gently on his red tunic. "Please, Mr. Soldier. I'm scared. I don't know where she went." That was the moment when James made his choice. Slowly, carefully, he shifted his eyes downward to meet the child's gaze. The movement was subtle enough that most tourists wouldn't notice, but, to the little girl, it was everything. Her face lit up with relief that someone had finally seen her, finally acknowledged her fear. "What's your name?" James whispered, his lips barely moving, his voice so quiet only she could hear. "Emma," she whispered back. "Emma, I need you to stay right here next to me, okay? Don't move away. I'm going to help you find your mummy, but I need you to be brave for just a little bit longer." The girl nodded, moving closer to stand beside his left leg. James began scanning the crowd more systematically, looking for any adult who seemed to be searching frantically for someone. His years of military training in observation and threat assessment now served a different purpose as he catalogued every face, every gesture, every sign of distress among the tourists. It took another 10 minutes before he spotted her, a woman in her 30s pushing through the crowd, calling out Emma. "Emma!" Her face was pale with panic, her movements desperate and uncoordinated. She was about 50 meters away, near the Victoria Memorial, searching in the wrong direction. James faced a dilemma. He couldn't leave his post, couldn't call out, couldn't wave to get the woman's attention. But he couldn't let this child remain lost when her mother was so close. Making another split-second decision that would have horrified his commanding officer, James did something that broke centuries of protocol. He moved. Not much, just a slight shift of his weight, a tiny step forward that brought him closer to the edge of his designated position. Then, keeping his rifle steady and his posture as correct as possible, he began what could only be described as the world's most subtle and dignified wave. Using just his left hand, positioned low against his leg where most tourists couldn't see it, he made small, deliberate gestures toward the searching woman. Emma, understanding instinctively what he was trying to do, began calling out to her mother. "Mummy! Mummy, I'm here. I'm with the nice soldier." It took several attempts, but eventually the woman heard her daughter's voice above the crowd noise. She spun around, spotted Emma standing beside the guard, and ran toward them, sobbing with relief. The reunion was everything James had hoped for: tears, hugs, and the kind of desperate gratitude that made his small breach of protocol worthwhile. "Thank you," the woman mouthed to him as she scooped Emma into her arms. "Thank you so much." James gave the tiniest nod, then resumed his perfect stillness as if nothing had happened. The woman and her daughter disappeared into the crowd, just another family among thousands of daily visitors. Most of the other tourists never even realized what had occurred. But, for James, everything had changed. In that moment of choosing humanity over protocol, he had discovered something profound about what it truly meant to serve. The uniform, the ceremony, the rigid traditions, they were all important. But, beneath the bearskin hat and behind the stoic expression was something more important: a human being with the power to help others. As his shift came to an end and his replacement arrived, James reflected on what had happened. He expected to feel guilty about breaking protocol, worried about potential consequences if his superiors discovered his actions. Instead, he felt a deep sense of rightness, as if he had finally understood why he had wanted to serve in the first place. That evening, James wrote a letter to his younger sister back home. He told her about London, about the palace, about the tourists and their cameras. But, mostly, he told her about a little girl named Emma who reminded him that sometimes the most important orders are the ones that come from the heart rather than from a commanding officer. The letter ended with a promise: "I want you to know, Katie, that if you're ever scared or lost, I hope there's someone like me nearby, someone willing to break a few rules to make sure you're safe." James never reported the incident officially, and neither did anyone else. But the story spread quietly among the guards through whispered conversations and knowing glances. It became part of the unofficial code that existed alongside the official one: protect and serve, yes, but never forget that beneath the ceremony and tradition, they were guardians of more than just buildings and protocols. They were guardians of the vulnerable, the lost, and the frightened. And, sometimes, being truly worthy of the uniform meant knowing exactly when to step outside its constraints. The next morning, James returned to his post with renewed purpose. The bearskin hat felt the same, the rifle had the same weight, the tourists still gathered with their cameras and their attempts to provoke reactions. But something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer just playing the role of a guard, he had become one, in every sense that mattered. And, when he spotted another child in the crowd, a young boy who seemed to be looking around uncertainly for his parents, James was ready. Ready to serve. Ready to protect. Ready to remember that the highest honor of wearing the uniform was not in following orders perfectly, but in knowing when compassion mattered more than protocol. The boy's reunion with his family happened even more smoothly than Emma's had, a testament to James's growing skill at helping while maintaining the appearance of perfect stillness. As the grateful father shook his hand discreetly before departing, James realized he had found his calling not just as a soldier, but as someone who could make a difference in small but meaningful ways. The tourists continued to take their photos, unaware that they were capturing not just a ceremonial figure, but a guardian angel in disguise. 3 months had passed since James Mitchell's first encounter with lost children at Buckingham Palace, and word of his quiet acts of kindness had spread through the guard ranks like ripples in still water. What had begun as one young soldier's instinctive compassion was becoming something larger, a subtle revolution in how the guards understood their role. Sergeant Williams had noticed the change immediately. Not in any official capacity, there were no reports, no documented incidents, no breaches of protocol that reached his desk. But he had been supervising royal guards for 15 years, and he knew when something was different. The younger guards stood differently now. They still maintained their perfect posture and unwavering stillness, but there was something more alert in their bearing, something more purposeful in their vigilance. On a crisp October morning, Williams found himself paired with Guardsman Sarah Chen for a special ceremony at Windsor Castle. Sarah was one of the first women to serve in the household division, and, at 24, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that had made her a natural fit for the prestigious position. She had heard the stories about James and the lost children, and they had planted seeds in her mind about what service really meant. The ceremony was a memorial service for veterans of the Korean War, with elderly survivors and their families gathering to honor fallen comrades. Sarah's post was at the entrance to St. George's Chapel, where she would stand guard as the dignitaries and families filed past. It was an honor to be chosen for such a significant event, and she was determined to perform flawlessly. The morning proceeded according to plan. Military officials in dress uniforms, government ministers, members of the royal family, and dozens of elderly veterans with their medals gleaming in the autumn sunlight. Sarah maintained her position perfectly, aware of the cameras and the significance of the moment, but also increasingly aware of one particular attendee who was struggling. He was perhaps 85 years old, wearing a dark suit with a chest full of service medals that marked him as one of the Korean War veterans being honored. But what caught Sarah's attention was not his decorations, it was his obvious distress. He was alone, separated from the other family groups, and he was shaking visibly as he approached the chapel entrance. At first, Sarah assumed his trembling was due to age or the cool morning air. But, as he drew closer, she could see the tears streaming down his weathered face, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, the labored breathing that suggested he was on the verge of a panic attack. The old veteran stopped directly in front of her, swaying slightly on his feet. Other attendees flowed around him like water around a stone, most too focused on the ceremony to notice one elderly man's distress. Sarah felt her training at war with her instincts. She was supposed to remain motionless, to be part of the ceremonial backdrop. But this man was clearly in crisis. "I can't," he whispered, so quietly she almost missed it. "I can't go in there." Sarah's peripheral vision revealed that Sergeant Williams was positioned about 20 meters away, but his attention was focused on the arriving dignitaries. The ceremony was proceeding on schedule, and any disruption would be highly inappropriate. Yet here stood a man who had served his country with honor, now paralyzed by whatever memories this memorial service had awakened. Making the same kind of split-second decision that James had made months earlier, Sarah made the tiniest adjustment to her position. Instead of staring straight ahead, she angled her gaze just slightly downward, making eye contact with the distressed veteran. "Sir," she said, her voice barely audible, "you don't have to go inside if you're not ready." The old man's eyes widened with surprise and relief. Someone had seen him. Someone understood that he was drowning in memories too painful to bear alone. "They were just boys," he whispered back, his voice cracking. "My whole unit. Just boys, and I'm the only one left. How do I walk in there and listen to speeches about heroes when I'm still here and they're not?" Sarah felt her heart break for this man who had carried survivor's guilt for over 70 years. She understood now why he couldn't enter the chapel. It wasn't about the ceremony, it was about facing the ghosts of the friends he had lost. "You being here honors them," she whispered back. "You don't need to go inside to do that. Just being here, remembering them, that's enough." The veteran nodded, but he was still shaking. The ceremony would begin in minutes, and Sarah knew that once it started, she would need to maintain absolute stillness and silence. But this man needed help now, and there was no one else positioned to provide it. In what would later be remembered as one of the most subtle acts of rebellion in Royal Guard history, Sarah made another tiny adjustment. She shifted her rifle position minutely, creating a small space beside her post. Then, with the barest whisper, she said, "Would you like to stand with me? You don't have to go in, but you don't have to face this alone either." The veteran looked at her with wonder, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then, slowly, he moved to stand beside her, just as little Emma had stood beside James months earlier. But this was different. This was a fellow soldier finding shelter beside another soldier, a shared understanding that transcended rank and generation. As the ceremony began and the chaplain's voice echoed from inside the chapel, Sarah and the veteran stood together in perfect stillness. To any observer, it might have looked like nothing more than an elderly gentleman respectfully waiting outside during the service. But Sarah could feel the man's breathing gradually steadying, his trembling slowly subsiding. Halfway through the ceremony, something unexpected happened. Other elderly veterans began to notice the man standing beside Sarah. One by one, several of them quietly left the chapel and came to stand nearby. They didn't speak, they simply positioned themselves in a loose circle around Sarah's post, creating an impromptu memorial of their own. Sergeant Williams noticed the gathering, of course. His first instinct was to intervene, to restore proper order and ensure the ceremony proceeded without irregularities. But, as he watched the scene unfold, he realized what was happening. These veterans weren't disrupting the ceremony, they were creating their own version of it, one that felt more authentic and meaningful than the formal proceedings inside the chapel. The veteran beside Sarah was no longer alone with his memories. He was surrounded by other survivors, other men who understood the weight of being the ones who made it home. They stood in comfortable silence, each lost in their own remembrances, but united in their shared experience. When the official ceremony concluded and attendees began filing out of the chapel, they found the veterans still standing in their quiet circle. Some of the family members and dignitaries paused to pay their respects to this informal gathering, recognizing it as something profound and organic that had grown out of genuine need rather than official protocol. As people began to disperse, the original veteran turned to Sarah one final time. "Thank you, soldier," he said, his voice steady now. "You reminded me that standing guard takes many forms." He pressed something small into her gloved hand, a Korean War service medal, one of his own. "This belonged to my best friend, Tommy Chen. Same last name as you, if you can believe it. He died at Chosin Reservoir when he was 19 years old. I've carried this for 73 years, wondering what to do with it." Sarah looked down at the medal, overwhelmed by the weight of what he was giving her. "Tommy would have been proud to know that someone like you was standing guard for people like us," the veteran continued. "Keep it, and remember that honor isn't just about following orders. Sometimes it's about knowing when to break them." As the crowd dispersed and Sarah's shift ended, she found herself standing alone with Sergeant Williams. She expected a reprimand, a lecture about maintaining position and following protocol. Instead, Williams looked at the medal in her hand, then at the space where the veterans had stood their informal vigil. "Guardsman Chen," he said quietly, "can you explain to me what happened here today?" Sarah took a breath, preparing to defend her actions. But Williams raised a hand to stop her. "Actually, don't explain," he said. "I saw what happened. I saw an elderly veteran who was struggling, and I saw you provide exactly the kind of support he needed. I saw other veterans find comfort in standing together. I saw people being human while maintaining their dignity and honoring their service." He paused, looking out at the now empty courtyard where the ceremony had taken place. "There's a difference between discipline and compassion, Chen. The best soldiers understand that sometimes the highest form of discipline is knowing when compassion matters more than protocol. Today, you showed that understanding." That evening, Sarah wrote her first letter home since joining the Guards. She told her family about the ceremony, about the veteran who couldn't face his memories alone, about the medal now carefully stored in her personal belongings. But, mostly, she wrote about discovering that being a guardian meant more than just protecting buildings or following orders. "I learned today that we're not just guards," she wrote. "We're witnesses. We stand watch not just over palaces and ceremonies, but over the moments when people need someone to see them, to acknowledge their pain, to offer them a place to belong." The story of Sarah and the Korean War veteran spread through the Guard ranks just as James's story had, becoming part of the growing legend of soldiers who understood that true service sometimes required creative interpretation of their duties. But, more importantly, it established something that would define the Guards for years to come: the understanding that their most important role was not in being seen, but in seeing others. Within weeks, similar incidents began occurring throughout London. Guards began noticing elderly people who needed assistance, tourists who were lost or distressed, children who were frightened or separated from their families. Each situation was handled with the same delicate balance of maintaining official protocol while providing genuine human assistance. The changes were subtle enough that they never attracted official attention, but significant enough that they transformed the culture of the Guard units. New recruits learned not just about standing at attention and following orders, but about reading crowds for signs of distress, about providing help while maintaining dignity, about understanding that the uniform represented service to all people, not just to official ceremonies. Sarah's medal from Tommy Chen became a symbol of this evolution, though few knew its story. She carried it with her on every shift, a reminder that honor and duty could take many forms, and that sometimes the most important moments in a soldier's service were the ones that would never appear in any official record. The Korean War Memorial Service had been captured by dozens of cameras and would be remembered in official histories and news reports. But the real story, the story of an elderly veteran finding peace beside a young guard, of survivors gathering in spontaneous solidarity, of compassion triumphing over protocol, would live on in the whispered traditions of the Guards themselves, passed down from one generation of soldiers to the next. The transformation within the Guard units had been gradual but undeniable. 6 months after Sarah Chen's encounter with the Korean War veteran, and nearly a year since James Mitchell first helped a lost child, the unofficial culture of compassionate service had become woven into the fabric of daily duty. What had begun as isolated acts of individual kindness had evolved into something approaching an unspoken code of conduct. Sergeant Williams found himself in an unexpected position. As one of the senior non-commissioned officers, he had initially worried about maintaining discipline and protocol among his charges. But the changes he had witnessed were not signs of deteriorating standards, they were evidence of soldiers who understood their duties at a deeper level than mere rule following. Still, he knew that this evolution needed careful guidance to prevent it from becoming a liability. It was during the Christmas season that the most significant test of this new approach would come, in the form of Guardsman David Park, a recent recruit who had completed his training just 2 weeks earlier. Park was 20 years old, soft-spoken, and still adjusting to the weight of responsibility that came with the red tunic and bearskin hat. He had heard the stories about James and Sarah, about the quiet acts of kindness that had become legendary among the younger guards, and he was eager to prove himself worthy of the tradition. His first major assignment was a Christmas Eve posting at the Tower of London, where tourists flocked to see the crown jewels and participate in special holiday programming. It was considered a prestigious assignment for such a new guard, and Park was determined not to disappoint his superiors. The tower was particularly busy that day, filled with families taking advantage of the school holidays to visit London's historic sites. Park had been standing his post for about an hour when he noticed something troubling near the entrance to the jewel house. A young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, was sitting on a bench with her head in her hands, clearly distressed. She had been there when Park first took his position, and she hadn't moved since. At first, Park followed protocol perfectly. Eyes forward, stance rigid, attention focused on his duties. But, as minutes turned into an hour, and the young woman remained in obvious distress, he began to feel the same internal conflict that his predecessors had experienced. Other tourists walked past her without a second glance, absorbed in their holiday plans and sightseeing agendas. Park's concern deepened when he noticed that the woman was shivering despite wearing a heavy winter coat. London's December weather was particularly harsh that year, with temperatures well below freezing and a bitter wind cutting through the tower's ancient courtyards. The woman appeared to have been sitting in the cold for quite some time. During his second hour of duty, Park watched as two security guards approached the woman. He couldn't hear their conversation from his post, but he could see their body language becoming increasingly authoritative. The woman shook her head repeatedly, clearly refusing whatever they were asking her to do. The security guards eventually walked away, leaving her alone on the bench. It was then that Park noticed something else. The woman was clutching a small photograph in her hands, staring at it intently between periods of covering her face. From his position, he couldn't make out the details of the image, but something about her behavior suggested this was more than simple tourist fatigue or cold weather discomfort. As his shift approached its final hour, Park made a decision that would have significant consequences. He began what he privately called controlled observation, a technique he had learned from listening to James and Sarah's experiences. While maintaining his official posture and position, he used peripheral vision and brief, carefully timed glances to gather more information about the situation. What he discovered alarmed him. The photograph the woman was holding appeared to be of a young man in military uniform. She would look at it for long moments, then press it to her chest, then look at it again. Her distress was not random, it was focused, purposeful, and profound. Park realized he was witnessing someone in the grip of deep grief, possibly triggered by the location or the season. The Tower of London, with its history of imprisonment and execution, could be a difficult place for someone dealing with loss. The Christmas season only amplified such feelings for those who were spending the holidays without loved ones. The dilemma was more complex than those faced by James or Sarah. The woman was not lost, not in immediate danger, and not asking for help. She was simply existing in a space of profound sadness, and, technically, that was not something that required intervention. But every instinct Park possessed told him that leaving her alone in her grief was wrong. As tourists continued to flow past, many of them families laughing and taking photos, the contrast with the woman's solitary sorrow became more stark. Park found himself thinking about his own family's Christmas traditions, about the joy and warmth waiting for him when his shift ended. The thought that someone could be so alone and hurting, surrounded by celebration, felt unbearable. With 15 minutes left in his duty period, Park made his choice. He broke one of the most fundamental rules of guard duty. He left his post. Not completely, and not obviously. Park executed what could best be described as a strategic repositioning, moving from his assigned station to a position roughly 10 meters away that still allowed him to maintain visual surveillance of his original area while bringing him closer to the distressed woman. To casual observers, it might have looked like a routine patrol adjustment. As he drew nearer, Park could hear that the woman was quietly crying. The photograph she held was indeed of a young soldier, and written on the back in faded ink were the words, "Love always, Michael, Christmas 1983. The date was significant, it was exactly 40 years ago. "Excuse me, miss," Park said quietly, his voice gentle but official. "Are you all right? Do you need assistance?" The woman looked up, startled. Her eyes were red from crying, and her face bore the exhausted expression of someone who had been grieving for hours, possibly days. "I'm sorry," she said, starting to stand. "I know I shouldn't be sitting here so long." The security guards already told me I needed to move along, but I couldn't leave yet. You don't need to move, Park assured her. I'm not here to ask you to leave. I just wanted to make sure you were safe. The woman sat back down, clutching the photograph more tightly. His name was Michael, she said, as if the words had been building pressure inside her for hours. My brother. He was killed in the Falklands 40 years ago today. Christmas Eve. Park felt his heart stop. This wasn't just someone having a difficult day, this was someone marking the anniversary of a devastating loss, alone, in the cold, at one of London's most public tourist attractions. He always wanted to see the crown jewels, she continued, her voice breaking. Even as a little boy, he was fascinated by the tower, by the history, by all of it. I promised him we'd come together someday, but then, he joined the army, and then. She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Park understood immediately why she was here, why she couldn't leave, why the security guard's instructions to move along had fallen on deaf ears. She wasn't just visiting the Tower of London, she was fulfilling a 40-year-old promise to her dead brother. What was Michael like? Park asked, completely abandoning protocol now and sitting down beside her on the bench. For the next 10 minutes, as tourists and staff bustled around them, the woman told Park about her brother. Michael had been 21 when he died, just a year older than Park was now. He had been funny, adventurous, and completely devoted to their family. He had sent the photograph home just days before he was killed, with a letter promising to take her to see the crown jewels when he returned from his deployment. I come here every year on Christmas Eve, she admitted. I know it's silly, but I tell him about what I've seen, about changes in the tower, about new exhibits. This year felt different, though. 40 years, it feels like such a long time and no time at all. Park listened, and, in listening, he provided something the woman had been missing all day: recognition of her grief, acknowledgement of her brother's memory, and companionship in her annual ritual of remembrance. When she finished talking, Park made another decision that would have horrified his instructors but felt absolutely right in the moment. He stood, executed a perfect military salute, and held it for several seconds. For Michael, he said simply. The woman burst into tears, but, for the first time that day, they were tears of gratitude rather than despair. Someone in uniform, someone who understood service and sacrifice, had honored her brother's memory. The gesture was small, lasting only moments, but its impact was profound. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for seeing him. Thank you for seeing me. Park's shift was officially over, and his replacement would arrive at any moment. But he made one final choice that completed his transformation from rule follower to compassionate guardian. Would you like to see the crown jewels? He asked. I mean, would Michael have wanted you to see them? Today, for both of you? The woman nodded, unable to speak. Park escorted her to the entrance of the jewel house, where he quietly explained the situation to the staff member on duty. Within minutes, arrangements were made for a brief, private viewing, a courtesy extended to a Gold Star family member whose brother had died in service to the crown. As the woman emerged from the jewel house 20 minutes later, her face had transformed. The crushing weight of solitary grief had been replaced by something lighter, more peaceful. She had finally completed the promise she had made to her brother 4 decades earlier. He would have loved it, she told Park as they walked back through the tower grounds. Especially the imperial state crown. He always said he wanted to see the Black Prince's ruby. Park's replacement had arrived and taken position, allowing him to escort the woman to the tower's exit. As they reached the gates, she turned to him one final time. I don't know your name, she said, but I want you to know that you've given me the best Christmas gift I've received in 40 years. You helped me keep a promise I thought I'd never be able to fulfill. She pressed the photograph of Michael into Park's hand. Keep this, she said. Remember that every person in uniform is someone's son, someone's brother, someone's hero. Remember that the greatest honor we can give them is to remember their humanity, not just their service. That evening, Park returned to his quarters with a new understanding of what it meant to wear the uniform. He had broken multiple regulations, abandoned his post, and prioritized personal compassion over official duty. By traditional military standards, his actions could have resulted in disciplinary action. Instead, when he reported to Sergeant Williams the following morning and truthfully recounted the events of Christmas Eve, he found himself facing not punishment, but recognition. "Guardsman Park," Williams said after hearing the complete story, "you have demonstrated something that cannot be taught in training manuals or learned from regulations. You have shown that true service means being present for people at their moments of greatest need, even when those moments occur in ways we cannot predict or prepare for." Williams paused, looking at Michael's photograph, which Park had brought with him to the meeting. "The Tower of London has been a place of imprisonment, execution, and death for nearly 1,000 years. But, yesterday, because of your actions, it became something else for one person. It became a place of healing, of promise-keeping, of love triumphing over loss. That transformation happened because you chose to see a grieving sister rather than just a woman sitting on a bench." The story of David Park and Michael's sister became the capstone of the Guards' evolution from ceremonial figures to genuine guardians of human dignity. It demonstrated that their transformation was complete, that the culture of compassionate service had become self-sustaining and would continue to grow with each new generation of Guards. Within the year, the informal practices that had begun with James Mitchell's first encounter with a lost child had become formally recognized, though never officially codified. New Guard training began including discussions about situational awareness, community service, and the balance between protocol and humanitarian response. The changes were subtle but profound, reflecting a new understanding that the greatest honor of wearing the uniform came not from perfect stillness, but from perfect readiness to serve when service was truly needed. The photograph of Michael remained with the Guard unit, passed from one member to another as a reminder of their expanded mission. Each Christmas Eve, Guards would observe a moment of silence in his honor, and, throughout the year, they carried forward the lessons learned from his sister's pilgrimage, that grief deserves recognition, that promises matter even across decades, and that sometimes the most important person in a crowd is the one sitting alone. The revolution that had begun with a lost child named Emma had culminated in the recognition of a fallen soldier named Michael, proving that compassion, like courage, could spread from person to person, creating ripples of kindness that extended far beyond any single act of service.